so around 2011, at the end of the van Rensburg textbook, we see the emergence of a new thrust, or perhaps it's not so new, but a revision of some of these key principles. And driving this is the idea of universal health coverage. And the students will remember we've spoken very briefly to the difference between universal health coverage, universal health care. And with UHC, which was being driven also through the outcomes of the Millennium Development Goals. We've spoken a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals and this global push towards equity and access to healthcare. So we see the start of our green paper on national health insurance in 2011, which is followed by the white paper in 2015. And we still sit now in the present with our national health insurance bill, where we're looking at how are we actually going to restructure in light of many of the challenges we inherited in trying to implement national health National Health Act at a time of a huge pandemic. So perhaps we could crystallize our conversation around where we sit now with the National Health Insurance Bill, and what this means for our health system, and why it's so important to look back at the experiences of people leading up to this moment, so that we don't replicate or make this similar or same mistakes going forward.
Wouldn't it be wonderful in some ways to ask all of the students to imagine themselves in the position of being a key advisor at this present moment to the Health Minister, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, and to Cyril Ramaphosa, our Head of State? What would be the key learnings that would have come from various epidemics we've discussed, including the 1918 one that spurred us into our first very fragmented and imperfect, but still our first National Health Act of 1919, and then taking into account smallpox, tuberculosis, the various polio epidemics, the epidemics of measles outbreaks, the challenges with cholera and with diphtheria, and then all the way through to what we've just been discussing, which is this absolutely earth-shaking HIV/AIDS pandemic that we were the country to receive the greatest burden of. With all of this knowledge in mind, with all of the moments in time that we've lost, either through racism, through a lack of courage about grasping the nettle of being a common citizenry together, through many, many periods of economic downturn and of people being challenged to spend the resources of the state in other areas, we finally come up for air after the worst phase of the HIV pandemic has passed us by, and we sit with at least effective drugs, though not a vaccine. And we sit down together as a society in 2011 and we say, right, this is what we're going to commit to. And the last couple of years, and the students will know this probably through their last years of high school, have been very, very challenging. How do we find a way to pool the best of what we have been able to achieve scientifically and clinically in curative health with some of the world's best private hospitals and some outstanding generations of specialists? How do we pool that and all the skewed resources that go into that, from people in the class whose parents have got the resources to have private health care, and people in the class who come from families with no access to private health care? How do we draw those health resources and budgets together to make a system that is fairer and better for middle class and wealthier people, and to make a system that at the moment is just not delivering the goods, at least not in some sectors of health, to the majority of South Africans? How do we pull that so that everybody's boat rises, so that people who are middle class and whose families are being squeezed every single month by the rising costs of private health care without the good benefit of preventative health care, and people who are struggling in families where, for example, the burden and the cost of waiting for particular operations or interventions in the public system, or waiting for endless amounts of time to get access to needed chronic medication and drugs, or better still, really having outstanding primary healthcare clinics in our own districts so that we can really access the best of preventative medical knowledge. How can we draw these together so that nobody loses and everybody feels out of this a common sense of citizenship and of commitment to one another, and a way of actually redressing the past without losing expertise, without losing faith in one another, and with a sense of justice? This has been the extraordinary project of the minds of South Africa's health planners the last few years. And Wits University has a lot of skin in the game, because the Center for Health Policy Studies at Wits has been a leading member of the team planning this. Most of the hearings that took place that involved health professionals and all the big private health insurance companies took place with a huge amount of involvement of health thinkers and health planners from Wits. And very, very careful and detailed projects and plans have been put forward and have been debated in the public domain. And once again, Stephen, we sit at the very edge of a huge landscape where we're supposed to move now into implementation. We've agreed. This Parliament has heard the words of all different parties, and everybody has said there are ways that we can cooperate in the middle, including people who have a deep interest in maintaining private healthcare, namely the providers of that. There's been lots of agreement. And as we are putting the final dots on the I's and crosses on the T, our country is in the middle of gasping or waiting for the full effect of Corona-19 to hit us. What would the students advise our health minister and our cabinet at this time, given what they've read in the last 12 to 14 weeks? What are the lessons that we should learn from the past? What should we definitely avoid? And how can we use this moment again to form solidarity and to share resources? Because one of the things that we've seen in the last few years, Stephen, is that when triple burdens of morbidities and mortalities coalesce, when, for example, in my family, there might be people suffering from hypertension, exposure to different cancers. They're not dealing with malnutrition in the sense of hunger, but people have been living lifestyles where they have been eating foods that have been causing harm to their bodies. They've been having particular kinds of stress which are different from the stress burdens of the poor, but the net effect on middle-class families in South Africa has been very, very high burdens of ill health in new ways. On the other hand, even though we've addressed some aspects of malnutrition with our social grants, we've been able to roll out better food and feeding schemes for vulnerable children in schools, and we have been able to get better primary health care out to many people and cleaner water out to many people in our society. We still know that the burden of, for example, diabetes, of kidney disease, of various kinds of comorbidities with tuberculosis and with HIV has brought a very, very heavy burden onto our country's health system. And we're sitting with a situation described by Van Rensburg in his last pages of actually higher rates of ill health in our country than we even had, say, 20 years ago. With all of this in mind, how can we look at each other and say, this is a nimble, responsible, taxpayers' investment that we can come together to platform? And as this COVID-19 kiboshes our health system potentially again and our economy, it is even more important, I would argue, to use the resources that we have, both the universities that are public institutions that produce the scholars, the clinicians, the health planners, like the people in our own class, paid for out of the public purse, out of the taxpayers of the country, and the roads and the water systems and the sewage systems and the electricity systems, which we've all invested in together. How can we draw these all together into this national health insurance to make sure that there's care, a minimum standard of care that gives us all a benefit? This is the challenge we're facing right now, Stephen. and the students are not dealing with a hypothetical question. As they come to the end of the course, they're not sitting and thinking about, almost a fantastical utopia or dystopia. This is our country right now. This is the moment that we're sitting on. The papers that they write for their exams this mid-year are directly related and could even be sent as a package to the National Minister of Health.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Yeah. And I think I find it as daunting as it is, I also find it encouraging. This is unfortunately, the legacy and the burden that we leave with our students, to take up for these challenges, and think about them in a deep and nuanced way, and to know that of course they're not alone in this project. That there's a lot that we can draw on from our history. So I'd like to take this last opportunity to thank you, Catherine, for delivering a most fascinating set of discussions around the health and health system, history of health and health system in our country. Throughout this process, I've learned a huge amount from you, and I know the students have too. So thank you once again.
It's been my honor. And I also would like to end also with one last comment on a very hopeful note. Wherever I've traveled all over, whether it was studying degrees abroad or going to conferences, which I've spent a lot of time in, and even recently I've been in two-day conferences on Zoom with health historians, a consortium at Princeton, which is in the United States, and then one that was hosted by the University College London, in the middle of the UK. And the enormous respect that people have for South African health professionals, South African health planners and clinicians, it's astounding. I mean, we historians even get some of the sort of fairy dust sprinkled on us from that. And as you were telling me earlier today, our president just this very morning was part of an international consortium sitting and discussing responses to COVID-19. All over the world, people look at, and sometimes with envy, the way that we've been able to develop these outstanding world-class policies, and where we have been able to implement astounding responses to tremendous health challenges. The response that we were able to mount in the face of this HIV pandemic is an extraordinary testimony to what we are able to do as a society. This is in no way to cover over all of the enormous challenges that we face, but something about our history of struggle and challenge, about the honesty that we have to bring to bear to confront these wicked problems of our past and present, creates in the mind of many South African professionals and also ordinary people a kind of honesty and a sort of chutzpah or spirit or chias, as some people would say. Some people would also describe it as, the brain meets the heart, a kind of Ubuntu. And when we get into that space as a society, we are really world class. History will judge how this generation that we're in now deals with this COVID period, which I think will be with us for a while, and the implementation of our national health insurance. And it will be the young professionals from this class who will have to go out and measure the effects of it and manage its implementation and steward it into the future. And I think we've got enormous benefits when we compare ourselves to places like the United States, which is a country in real chaos about its health system now. We have got some advantages that we can draw on. And so I really do want to end on that hopeful note. It's a time of tremendous uncertainty, but it's also a time when young people taking degrees like this are more needed than they have ever been before. And it will be very interesting to see when I'm in my Zimmer frame, if I make it to rickety old age, and I can look back on the period from about 2020 to say 2028, let's say this next 8-year phase, and see where this cohort of students that you're teaching end up. It will be really fascinating to see what difference they can make.
Thank you once again. And I think that's a challenge the students will happily take on.